Welcome everyone to the VITA Learning webinar today with Peter Pizzi. This is the third of a series of, actually we've added 2 additional webinars, so this will be the third out of 6. We're having it every Tuesday, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So everyone right now is currently in a listen only mode. So what you want to do is on your panel, your screen, go ahead and throw any questions to Peter as we go through the webinar, and we will stop as needed and have him ask those pertinent questions. And then, of course, we always have a question session, if you will, at the end of the webinar as well. So welcome, Mr. Peter Pizzi. I hope everything is well. And I believe you're on, you're showing the screen, and we're all good to go.
All right, Mr. Jim, well, I guess we will get rolling then. So welcome back to everybody. It's hard to believe this is week 3. I know it's kind of crazy, right? 3 weeks or 2 full weeks have passed, and boy, time flies when you're maybe not having as much fun as we used to. But let's have a quick review for the last few weeks. I think session 1 or module 1 was a diagnostic communication material overview, and I won't spend much time with this except to say that I think the important messages there for me was, as you know, I always start with the why. Why are we doing what we do, how we do it? And if you remember this specific case, this was one of the cases that had 5 different materials on it, including PFM and feldspathic veneer and all the other things that we talked about with it. We also talked about some of the material options, and my sarcastic part on the screen there that says 9 million megapascal. I think you know I'm being sarcastic and joking around. But what I really tried to emulate on the point was that in the end, restorative wise, we want to make that to the ultimate of our ability, but it's really about how the patient feels and creating the smile and the comfort zone with the patient. And then as we went through the materials in module 1, I told you that I still think metal ceramic is a viable material. I still do it for many different reasons, and on this particular case, which was a metal ceramic case, I think there's still a lot of value in the metal ceramics. Module 2, we really focused on lithium silicates and desilicate materials. And I think the importance of this was really, for one, to break them down a little bit more. I know we kind of throw around brand names with this product rather than the importance of the material itself and its values. And I went through all the strengths and some of the weaknesses and some of the challenges, and I showed you some of the cases and so forth that we had gone through. And then I also kind of showed you the structures, the differentials in desilicate compared to silicate, and the combinations of the two when you're milling desilicate, which I thought was critical. And then if you remember, the main keys here were space and selection. So it was really about the space that we're filling and the selection and in our selection, and then what's the underlying shade structure. And then we also touched on surface, right? With prep design and the sandblasted design, breaking surface tension. And then lastly, we went through some contour, and I said that'll start to lead into module 3, which will be more about zirconia. I did throw a few extra little slides in here because I'm actually finishing up a case of the lab that I thought was kind of cool. That was a pure lithium silicate case, and I wanted to show you this is out of the mill. And I don't know why, but this is exciting to me just to see it this way. I guess it's so different from what I'm used to, right? Either working with wax or an ingot, that I can actually mill something that looks so cool, has this kind of honey look to it, and fits so well right out of a milling machine that it's kind of cool. So here's what the material looks like pre-sintered. And I wanted you to kind of see that the silicate, why I tend to favor it a little bit for some of the higher aesthetics. I think the newer lithium disilicates are kind of getting into the same range, but right now, because I'm still a little more comfortable with this particular Suprenity material, I wanted to get a good look at the incisal edges. And even though it's a solid monolithic unsintered material, you'll notice how the light reflection along those edges is already a little bit different and kind of interesting. And if I change the light, I want you to notice how some of the opalescence in the materials kind of really exhibits itself. I don't think VITA or any of the companies sell these materials telling you that they're truly opalescent, but if you look at them in this stage, you can actually see that they do have some opal ability to them. And I think that's important for us to notice. And then we're going to get a lot more into the layering system or the micro layering system as we get into a little bit in today, and definitely in next session when we start talking about veneers and layering. And by the way, my layering system is kind of the same across the board. It doesn't really change. It's really the substructure that I make change and how I utilize that. One of the important questions that came in last week was how we actually work through the index that I mentioned in module 2. So I'm showing you a video of kind of an old school indexing process. And yeah, I work really fast when we're making those, right? Actually, this is one of them from NYU. And you can see we're just mixing up a very rigid putty. We usually want something around 70 or 80 shore hardness, and we're putting it into a pressure pot, and that's kind of really adapting the material to the wax up as best as possible. And then we're going to go back and kind of trim that material away and create kind of an angulation so that we're really exposing the teeth. Now, I'm showing you something that I don't do anymore. This was kind of the old school way of making an ideal transfer, should I say, or a matrices. I don't really think this is the right way. Why? Even though I'm using a very thick material, and even though it's fairly rigid, like I said, it's probably a 70 or 80 shore hardness, the bottom line of it is there's still a spring to the material. Because there's a spring, you're not really controlling the placement of the material. So if we move forward and you see the final result of that, although that looks really good and it's really thick, I'm going to tell you it's not half as accurate as what I do today. And what I'm doing today is I'm actually taking a very thin, let's say, pancake over the wax up. And Jen really deserves credit for all of this. She does it all in the lab most of the time. And you'll notice that it's just a very thin, only about 1 millimeter of thickness over the diagnostic wax up. And we're just using any putty to do that. It doesn't really matter at this point, the shore hardness or anything about it. Once it's hardened, we're actually going to use a clear tray material and make the tray over that putty. Now, the reason I said that putty doesn't matter is because that putty is now going to come off the cast and get thrown out. We don't need it anymore. And now we have a tray that gives me only about 1 millimeter of space all the way around the teeth, and also sits hardly on the palate. So I'm actually using the hardness to be against the palate. You'll notice we put 3 notches in it. And that's because now we're going to fill this with PVS impression material, polyvinyl siloxane. And what that's going to allow us to do is use a clear impression material to now actually take the impression of our wax up. You don't even need to do the pressure pot anymore. You can, but you really don't need to, because it's a form-fitted custom impression tray, basically. And I'll show you how well it actually works just quickly. So here's a quick wax up done on a study cast. Here's the impression of exactly what we just talked about with the 2-part sequence. You'll notice it seats on the palate, and the hard part is removable. And if I fill this with a little bit of a composite or a bisacryl, whatever you choose to do, and I'm going to push that on the model, you're going to see how much of it is actually pushed out of the model or out of the matrices, which is important. And you notice that I could actually light cure through this because it's clear, which makes it even better for us. So if you do choose to use composites, and we'll address that more in veneer section next week. But here's what I really wanted you to see. Look at the accuracy, look at the margin integrity. And remember, that's on a stone cast. That's not on a soft tissue actual intraoral environment. So you're going to get a lot better transfer from doing that. And this was a technique I developed years ago when I started working with some transparent materials. So that was just a little quick recap. I'm sorry I'm flying through that. Let's move into the important stuff now for today, which is week 3, module 3, and Zirconia substructure. So let's start with a few basics. For one, when we talk about zirconia, I think, again, the company perspective is to show us all their materials a lot of times and tell us what the newest or best one is. And I try to avoid that concept, because what I want you to think of is, what do I need for this particular case at this moment? So the basic types of zirconias, especially with VITA, is going to be the HT, the XT, and the ST. And what's the difference between these is opacity. So the HT would be their most opacified, and the ST would be the most translucent at this point. why is this important? Well, it's important for you to understand when do you need those. Because I think what we're kind of taught a lot of times is, well, we want the high translucency, we want the cubic-y kind of look to it. Do we? I'm not sure that's really the case. And I think we have to always think about when you need that and why you need that. And this is why you, as the clinician or the dental technician, really have to have a good understanding of the material optics and what they can and can't do for you. So I'd like to walk you through a case quick, and I'd like you to kind of think it through as I'm going through it. We're obviously going to do a single central on the number 8, the 1, 1, and I have to match the adjacent tooth. Right away, your thought process should be, okay, if I'm going with zirconia, which is fine, which one? Do I want this to be opacified, or do I want it to be translucent? And I think part of that question becomes as well, do you want to layer it, micro layer it, fully layer it, or try to go monolithic? So I'm not a huge monolithic guy, especially for anterior. If it's posterior, I might have a different discussion with you, but in the anterior, this is either going to be either fully layered or micro layered, depending on either. And that would be the next part, is what's the prep shade that I'm looking at. So if I fill out 3 different copings, and I'll make one as an HT shaded, one as an HT white, and one as an XT, you should notice right away, just looking at them, that you can kind of see the opacity differences in them. And although this seems easy enough, I want to kind of prove it out to you. I want you to understand what I'm thinking. So if I put all 3 of these on the actual cast, you should notice that they look different. Look at how much lower in value this looks because it's colored. Look at how much whiter and opaquer this one looks. And you can kind of start to see some of the prep underneath this one. So the question comes back to your prep shade. Which one do I want there? Am I trying to mask the prep shade, or am I trying to accentuate the prep shade? And you have to be able to make that determination. But I'm going to make it a little harder for you, and I'm going to take a black magic marker, and I'm going to coat the prep itself. So now I have a darker preparation. Notice what happens between the white, more opacified, and the more translucent. And when you look at those two, I hope that makes you realize that although we really want the more translucent, especially in monolithic world, based on thickness, because the thicker I use it, the lower in value it will tend to appear, or the thinner I use it, the more translucent it becomes. And I have to start making a decision which one's right for me. So what I did with this sequence a while ago, just to kind of test this theory, was I actually built all of the restorations the same. I made a bunch of them, all different materials, excuse me. And I built them with the exact same dentins and enamels and so forth along the way. And in the end, if you're wondering which one I actually wound up using, it was the pure white, most opacified. This is an HT. And the point of that was I needed the opacity. And let's be honest, even in my restoration, I'd say might even be a hair undervalue in some areas, right? So, you know, maybe I could have pushed it a little bit more. But the point I'm making is, in order for me to get to that final restoration, I really had to understand my substructure or my underlying material. And in this case, I needed more opacity and more brightness to help raise the value. So the opacity is one part. The second part is, how do you design the zirconia? What's the right way to do this? Because I think the old school technicians, and I'll put myself in the old school league a little bit, because we were kind of taught to design copings as a coping, as just a thimble or a structure that fit over. And today, especially with all these materials, that's not the case anymore. Matter of fact, I've said, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard me say over the years, that when laboratories used to hire me to come into the lab to do hands-on courses, I did it for a long period of time, and then I stopped it. And I said, you know, this is kind of silly, because me teaching the ceramist just to use more blue in the corner doesn't really fix the challenge. The challenge really starts from the clinical side. How is the preparation done? What kind of a cord pack are you using? How is the positioning of the preparation? Is it full prep or minimal prep? And then the impression quality, and then the communication and the photography. And that's why all the diagnostic 1 was kind of so important, module 1. But now that it's in the lab, and hopefully we have all that information, now we have to realize that we don't have what we had years ago. And what I mean by that is, we're trying to use more micro-layered and monolithic materials. This was actually a case that I did in London, England, about a year or 2 ago. It was a live patient case. And what I mean by that is, now when I do hands-on courses, I usually want to work with the whole lab, not just one person of the lab. I want to work on design. I want to talk about the model and die work. I want to kind of go through a bigger picture, because all that bigger picture is what's going to help the ceramics or the aesthetic part of the lab be better. So what I've done with this particular case for this course, they had asked me to do a white and pink course. I designed the laterals as, should I say, micro layered. So there's lingual zirconia, and we're going to only have very minimally layered in the facial. I designed the centrals where there'll be full coverage. So I have 1.2, 1.5 millimeters of space across the board, and I'll utilize that to build it fully. And then, of course, the other lateral, again, is micro. So I have a lingual zirconia wall, and that goes right up at the incisal edge. What I'd also like you to notice is all the detail that's in there. So again, if I show it to you on the matrix, you'll notice that there's very little space or layering room for the laterals, and I have tons of space and room for layering on the centrals. And let's be honest today, this is very much the challenge of what we have across the board, isn't it? It's not what we did 10, 15 years ago, or we did 10 PFM crowns or 10 zirconia crowns. Now it's a veneer, an implant, a full coverage crown, a 3-unit bridge, another implant, and a micro layered window veneer. Right? And we're putting all that together. And that's why our strength has to be so, our toolbox has to be so much deeper, so we can actually have the ability to look at these cases and really understand what they need and how they need it. So what I'd also like you to notice is, as we're designing through the zirconia frame, and yes, we did this one as a wax up first and then copy milled it. We don't really do that anymore. I have to stop saying that was kind of pointed out to me today, I think, in a lecture that we did this morning. I use too much, so no more ums. That's it. You won't hear that anymore today. See, there it is. Now I won't do it again. In the end, I think what I wanted you to see here in this wax up is that if I'm looking at the shape of the tooth and I'm kind of trying to figure out what do I want the light to do, well, I'm looking at either convexities or concavities. So what do I mean by that? Well, where I want to reflect the light, I really want to have more convexity. I want the bump to come out. I want the high points to come out. And these are areas where I really want more light to reflect from the surface. Where I'm trying to absorb more of the light, I want concavity. I want to have more space here for my material. I want to be able to put more translucencies after the restoration, or towards the outside of the restoration. And I want to be able to absorb more light in certain areas. So we're designing that substructure to manipulate the light right from the beginning, not just at the end in the ceramic. And this will make your ceramic be much more minimally layered, so you won't need as much ceramic material, and also being able to manipulate the light a little bit more. So this was designed, and again, this was probably a year or two ago, I think, in London. I was actually supposed to be there in June, but I won't, so hopefully I'll be back again at the end of the year or beginning of next year. And this was milled in the XT, which is a fairly more translucent material, but because of the thickness of it, I'm going to still be able to get the light reflections and the light absorptions. And then I'm going to start working through the material. So what I've done with this particular case, and by the way, we used one of the participants in the lecture for this case. The person that we used was Rochelle. She's a great lady in London, a technician, and she's been to a lot of courses that I've done there over the years. So we actually took pictures of her mouth and we used her teeth as a reference to build this particular case. And I want to show you what I did here, because I think it's important. So besides for the convexities and the concavities of managing the zirconia itself, I'm now going to start going to my materials. And this is where I've actually used liner materials. I took my Effect Liner 3, which you'll see here around the two centrals. And then I also took a little Effect Liner 3 and I mixed in a little chroma stain to it. And I used that around the laterals. And the reason I did that was because, remember, I have more space to work with on the centrals. I have more depth. It's easier for me to create it in my powders. On the laterals, I have much less space, and I need to create the depth and the chroma kind of instantly. So I'm working by manipulating my material to do what I needed to do. So again, they're both EL3. The only difference is this EL3 is on its own. This EL3 actually has a little tiny bit of a stain in it, or a chroma. And then I actually took some of the EL1, which is the whiter material, And I'll use that to either extend or highlight the tip of my substructure, or I might even use it to highlight the middle third of the restoration. That's where I really want to raise my value. And again, I will break down the values in the next module or two, showing you how to really define that. And then I did one other thing. I took some of this EL1 and I actually mixed a little bit of blue stain into it. And I used that around the incisal edge areas of the 7 and 10, or the 1, 2, and the 2, 2. And why did I do that? Because I know I have a lingual wall there that is not going to let light go through it the exact same way that my 8 and 9 will allow the light to go through, where there's nothing there. There's space. So I'm trying to control the manipulation of light. And if you fire that, you can start to see what starts to happen already. You can see how much more intense the color is. And you can also see this bluey translucent effect around the laterals. And you also see the areas that reflect and absorb some more of the light on the 8 and 9. And now it's kind of a simple buildup because everything is really done for me. I'll start with my dentins, and I'm normally going to use 2 or 3 dentins right away. And why am I doing that? Because one, I'm trying to create chroma, I'm trying to create value, and I'm trying to create the age of the patient or the translucent effect towards the incisal edge. And if you look at this under refined light or light from the lingual side, you can see kind of right away that where I have the thicker materials, more of the light is not getting through. And where I've thinned the material or created these mamelon effects, I'm getting more light to come through. But what you should also notice is, remember, the laterals have lingual zirconia to them, and the centrals do not. But don't you notice how the light almost looks the same on all 4 of them? And that's because I was mixing a little bit of the blue stain into the EL1 to do that for me. And again, I'm always concerned with light transformation, so I'll start putting some mamelon materials on right away. And you'll notice the mamelon materials are reflecting some of the light because they're more opacified. And then I'll just finish up with my transition dentins and my enamels. I put some pink on, and I did this pretty much all in one bake at this point. And then we actually put it next to Rochelle's mouth to see if we were in the right ballpark. And I'd say, okay, we're close. I think, you know, she's got a little bit more warmth here and there and a few little things. And because I have that verbal diarrhea thing and I talk too much, I think we didn't have much more time to do much more in that course. So all we wound up doing was cleaning it up a little bit and doing a glaze bake on it just to show where we were and see if we could get all the effects out of it. But in the end, because the substructure gave me everything I needed, we were able to control the buildup process, and that made life a little bit easier for me, and it will for you if you start to understand each of those processes. So I also mentioned in module 1 that part of the trick of dealing with aesthetics is understanding the light transmission. And what do I mean by that? Again, is not only do the teeth have a light reflective ability, but it also goes up and down into the gingival tissue. And a lot of times when our restorations look weak, it's really just as much as the restoration being dead as it is as the light into the gingival area that would highlight the gingival tissue. And to do that, for me, the only real way to control that is by utilizing materials and being able to get light into the root of the tooth. So if you look at a natural root of the tooth, nice preparation here, and I cover it with a substructure. Well, that substructure can be metal ceramics, zirconia ceramics, even lithium, silicate, or desilicate, and they're going to all do a very similar thing. They're going to create a shadow on the actual root of the tooth. Yet if I cut away that margin with those materials, look what happens to the root of the tooth now. I'm allowing the light to actually go in there and get up underneath the pink, is what I really want. And that's what nature really does. So our job is to emulate nature to do that. So the way I look at it is this way. When I'm looking at the tooth itself, I'm looking at the chroma aspect, which is always on the cervical. I'm looking at the value, which is really in the middle third. And then I always say the incisal edge is really about the age of the patient. Is it a younger tooth, lots of mamelons and colors and brightness, or is it an older tooth with secondary dentin formation and not as much enamel, or the enamel is more demineralized and more translucent, and you get that more color chroma effect, kind of like the hence D3 shade that everybody picks, or the D2 shade. So I've actually gone backwards. Metal ceramic for me was always 360-degree ceramic margin. And I did that when I first started using zirconia materials years ago. But as time went on, the zirconia materials got better and better. They got more translucent. I was able to manage them better. And I kind of stopped doing it, to be honest with you. And about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I was looking at some zirconia cases in the mouth, and I just didn't like them. I'm like, I don't know, it just doesn't have the effect that I wanted to, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And then it hit me. You're not controlling the marginal. You're not controlling the light intake anymore. So since then, I cut all my zirconia materials back, and I actually do a ceramic margin on them. I actually like to do them with margin materials, and I'll show you why. But the bottom line between the two of them is that we need to, I threw an in there, that we need to break down optically which ones work better for us. So I'll throw this out at you now. We've had an overwhelming response to the webinars. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it. And we're going to add 2 more webinars to this series. So we're going to add a module 5. And in module 5, I'm going to go through shade communication and break down the tooth and really talk to you about that process and photography and the importance of taking the pictures and how to communicate that better. So that'll be more in module 5 now. And then we're also going to add a module 6, and that's going to be on implants with white and pink. So we're going to add 2 more modules for you guys, and it's only because of all the requests and you saying such great things. So thank you very much for that. So at this moment, the first case I showed you, I used liner materials to create some value and to create some warmth. And that's not a problem. I could use the liner materials all I want. Why would I want a liner material at all? Well, a liner material tends to be more fluorescent. And I want the fluorescence because zirconia or lithium, the silicate, doesn't really have fluorescence to it. Honestly, though, I would rather use a margin material than a liner material. And the reason for that is liner materials tend to have a little bit chunkier particles to them, and they reflect light or absorb light a little bit more. So I'm cutting the margin back anyway, and why not do this? And here's where I think I lose a few people here, because I know some people start to say, well, I don't do margins. I don't want to do margins. Just tell me what your wash layer is and let me move forward. So let me clear the air on that little topic so we're all on the same page. For one, everybody who's using zirconia is predominantly everybody using zirconia is doing some sort of a wash bake. Now, I have to be honest and tell you the concept of a wash bake, I don't necessarily agree with. And let me explain to you why. Science will prove me wrong on some areas, especially with the VITA ceramic. In other ceramics, I think you struggle a little bit more with the wash bake. But I mean, I speak to a lot of much brighter people than me, some PhD scientists behind the scenes, and they've conferred that even if we fire our ceramic a little higher, that when we put our next layer on, those 2 materials still bond fairly well. And I believe that. But here's where I go against it. So understand that when I use a liner or I use a margin material, they're materials that fire much higher, that already have fluorescence internally built in them, and I could use them to fill space. I could use them to not only improve my margin, but I could also use it if I didn't get a great design on my substructure. Let's say you're in a larger lab and you don't get to control the design and you get a coping most of the time. Well, now I have the ability that in my wash bake, as you call it, I can actually create the canvas I need. I can actually raise the value by creating convexities with brighter materials, or lower the value by creating the concavities with warmer materials or more light absorbing materials. So for me, I would tend to choose the margin materials to do that. And you'll notice I did exactly what we said before. I've actually incorporated more chroma into the margin. I've used more brightness around the middle third and up and down the line angles. And I've used more of a bluey translucent effect around the incisal edge area to my lingual zirconia. So I've created everything I needed. Can you do that with the liner material? 100%. Liner material fires higher. I think optically the margins are a little bit nicer, but you can do it with the liner material too. Why don't I use just a regular wash? I know what your regular wash is, right? You take dentin, you paint it onto your coping, you fire it higher, and that gives you a better bond to your zirconia. Yes, technically it does, but did it give you fluorescence? No. Did you help to reflect or refract the light? No. And you still haven't addressed the situation into the marginal aspect of the tooth. So your wash didn't really do anything except overfire a dented material, which is what a lot of you seem to use, that now gives you a more glassy matrix, and now I have to put new ceramic on top of that, which means I've created a surface tension there. So I kind of avoid that whole process, and I go right to my first liner or wash bake is this way, and it's with margin materials or liner materials. And that's standard for me in every zirconia case I do today. Same time, you'll notice when you look at all the restorations, this was a specific case. And by the way, this case is not in the mouth yet. Patient's still in provisional. The patient was let's say a serious bleeder at the moment, and we really couldn't insert anything, which I was happy not to be honest with you, because I wanted to kind of rework some of the case and do some things. But I wanted you to see my substructure. And as ceramists who are in the audience, I hope you look at this and you kind of think, wow, I would love to have that as my starting building my dentins and enamels on, rather than a coping with a wash on it that does really nothing for me. And that's kind of the way I approach it. So here's what my case would look like in its wash bake stage. And I hope that looks a lot different than what you would normally start with. Notice the chroma, notice where the value peaks are, and notice where the translucencies are. And that's all just because I controlled it with either a liner material or a marginal material. And it's the same process over and over again for me. And then I can actually start with my buildup. And now my buildup is going to be a little bit easier for me. Why? Because I already have the table or the canvas set. And I'm going to start either with my opacious dentins or my dentins. This was one of the first cases, or a big case, I should say, that I built up with the new Lumex material. And to be honest with you, that's one of the reasons I didn't mind going back and tweaking it, because I don't think you really get to know materials well until you really get to see them in the mouth over and over again. And I think it's important that we really get to evaluate our materials. So I'm kind of following the same steps that I did before. I'm going to increase the values in the middle third. I'm going to increase the chromas in the cervical, and I'm going to start to accent some of the translucent areas that I want to have more translucency. And then I go straight to my mamelon materials. I'm going to paint those mamelon materials on, and then into my dentin materials, and you can see how light is starting to kind of work for me already. You can see where the densities are, and I'm kind of reflective of more light, and where the translucencies and opacities are to give me a more natural look in the incisal area. And then I'll go back to my base dentins and transpod dentins if you're using, or in this system, there's actually just opacious dentin and dentin. And I'll start to use those. I might even mix some of my dentins and an enamel to get a little bit more translucency. And like I said, I'm not skipping through this. We'll break this down much more as we get into the veneer section. But in the end, you can see that I've got my whole buildup done. I'm going to put my enamels on, and I'm going to fire through that process. There's my final buildup, and then I'll fire that. And you can see the finished restorations, and I don't consider them finished, by the way. The plan of this was actually just to do a bisque try-in and see where we are and evaluate the tissue and the patient. But what I also did was when I went to see this patient, and I was lucky enough that the doctor let me come into the office and watch her insert. Like I said, the patient was a serious bleeder at the moment. I think he had just recently stopped smoking. And as soon as she pulled the provisionals off, it was kind of a mess. So we had no real intentions of inserting anything that day, but it was fun to kind of just put some things in and look. And I had also made an extra few copings, and I kind of wanted to be able to show you why I was doing what I did. So I want you to notice the coping on the number 9, where I did not cut the margin back. I didn't cut the margin back, and when we place that in the patient's mouth and I put light behind it, look at the color of the tissue and notice how dead it looks. And then in the final restorations, or the soon-to-be final restorations, where I actually cut the margin back and used fluorescent materials, look at the difference of how the light is actually getting up into that area. And that's what we really want to see more of, is getting more light to circulate throughout the restoration. So fortunately, I actually have this case back in the lab, and I'm tweaking it and playing with it a little bit, and I'm going to hopefully finish that. Actually, it's ready to be glazed, so hopefully I'll finish that up this week, and we can get our patient back and insert that. But I wanted to kind of just make one more example of the importance of getting that light up into the marginal area. This was a restoration, a single central, that the patient actually came into my lab for me to check and evaluate. So I quickly pulled the temp out. Yes, I know that's illegal, but I took the temp out and I slid their restoration in. And I'm not going to cement it because it's not my job. But what I want you to notice is we tend to kind of look here, right? All us technicians are looking at the incisal edge. Did I get the translucency right? Did I get the values right? And what I'm really looking at is up here. Look at the color of the gingiva around both teeth. And what I'm trying to see is that I get the light reflection, that I get the same light absorption in and out of the tooth. And although it's not cemented, it's just sitting on top of the tooth right now, notice the coloration on the pink above it if I shoot it under polarized. And the point I'm making is you can't get that if you're shadowing the root. And if you use either more opacified materials or even in the more translucent materials, sometimes you're going to create more shadow on the root than it's worth. This is where you need fluorescence. This is where you need marginal materials and either liner materials or something that's going to give you more fluorescence. So let's walk through a case and kind of put it all together. In the end, for me, everything always starts in the same spot. And step one is always about the incisal edge position. Where do the teeth belong in the patient's face? And I always develop that by looking at the face. And I think if you all look at this case, I hope you can start to right away make a conclusion of, well, I think she could use more teeth. I think we can lengthen the teeth and show a little bit more there. Well, great. Let's retract and see what we have. And you can see that she has teeth that are kind of pulled back and they're pretty short and worn and a lot of little issues there that we're going to have to manage. So we're going to have to start taking all the information. We're going to look at the patient's face, we're going to look at her photographs, and we're going to transfer the information. For me, most of my information transfer comes from a facial analyzer. That's a Coit's analyzer or a facial analyzer. And I want both. I want not only the facial analyzer, but I also want photographs. And by the way, I always feel like I'm skipping through things. This could be lecture number 7 if we wanted to do module 7 talking about occlusal concepts and other things. But today, for this point, I'm going to tell you that the beauty of a facial analyzer is that I'm going to actually get the aesthetic parameters or the aesthetic plane, and the functional plane, which is what I want in both. And why do I think this is important? Because if we're using an ear bow, which is not accurate, it's not a face bow, it's an ear bow because it sits in the auditory meatus, what you tend to get is an angulation on your plane that is not accurate to the human. By using a facial analyzer, you're getting a Bonwell concept mounting on the articulator, and you're also getting the horizontal plane that's similar to the patient. So it's a big difference, and I want you guys to pay attention to the differential on those casts that are there. Today, you don't need a Panadent to do that. You could use almost any articulator system you want. So I'm not selling any systems. You use the ones you like. But here's what I do like, and here's something that I push for everybody, is using what we call the transfer table. So this company, a friend of mine who owns this company, was nice enough to make these tables for every instrument. So if you're an Artex user, a Panadent user, a Stratus user, or the AD2 user, whatever company you use, you can now have a horizontal reference table that goes on your articulator. And I think that's really important. Actually, I know that's really important. For me, I'm always looking at the horizontal reference point and where I want the incisal edge position. So let me give you an example. You'll notice the wax up that's being done, and Jen did this wax up, I'm pretty sure, probably a few years ago. So as I'm pointing that out, she's sitting in the office cringing right now, saying, oh, I hate that wax up. But I want you to understand the process. The models are transferred to us by Dr. Bernadette. We actually have a horizontal reference point. And if we decide that we're going to lengthen the incisal edge by 2 millimeters, well, I'm going to take that table and drop it down 2 millimeters. And now when Jen starts waxing that case, she's just going to wax 2 millimeters right to the table. So we never lose the horizontal reference point in the aesthetic plane of the teeth. And that's really, really important for us. In the end, this became a very additive wax up, and it was a full coverage wax up. And I want to point out that, and we'll address this a lot more in the veneer section, but I just wanted to kind of mention that when do you make the determination of what's going to be full coverage, what's going to be minimally invasive, what's going to be a veneer? And that has a lot to do with not only the tooth position, but it has to do with the amount of enamel that's left on the tooth itself, meaning that when you have a decent amount of enamel, the flexural rate of the tooth is a little stiffer, it's a little different, because remember what I said in module 1. It's the combination of rigidity and flexibility that creates strength. But if I remove some of that enamel, or if the patient has removed it because of wear, chemical, abrasion, whatever the sequence is, that means that you now have a very flexible dentin. And just bonding a veneer to it is not going to solve your problem. So that automatically becomes a full coverage restoration. And you can see, again, another amazing full coverage preparation by Dr. Bernadette. She tends to do that all the time. And then when I look at this scenario, I can also even make a shell provisional. And this is the beauty of technology today, right? I can mill a shell provisional, or I can press one or inject it. I have so many options of how I want to do that today. And I think they're all good. It's just a matter of which one is best for this particular case. So Dr. Bernadette is going to actually place this in the patient's mouth with our matrix. And by the way, this matrix was a 6 years ago matrix, a little bit different version, but even that worked pretty well. And you can see, just looking at the patient's smile, you could tell right away she feels different and she feels better. And I always like to say, that day she decided to buy 28 units. She couldn't wait to have her restorations done. So then the next step comes to us. We now have these beautiful preps by Dr. B, and we want to start making the substructures. And you'll notice in the substructure that even back then we were thinking about the exact same things. I want to have concavities and convexities. Concavities where I want to absorb the light, and convexities where I want to reflect the light. And that was really the process. And I wound up building this at, I think, 28 single unit zirconias. And it was all built fairly easily based on the fact that we had the substructure to help us design and support. And you'll also notice that the teeth have some little rotations. And I think it's funny, Dr. Bernadette always says, where I kind of get a kick out of it, that she says, my patients pay me a lot of money to make their teeth straight, and I pay Peter a lot of money to make them crooked again. And in truth, it's kind of our running joke, but really what it comes down to is not every case should be a perfect straight alignment. And especially on the lowers, I think we should always have a little bit of a mix in there. But we worked that all out with the patient in the provisionals before we did the case. And for me, those are the cases that look the most natural as compared to the very white and straight kind of restorations that we sometimes have to do because it's what the patient likes. In the end, I think you can see that big difference in the face, right? Because again, looking at the restorations is easy. Figuring out how to get a little more translucency or a little mamelon, that's kind of easy. But making it all work to the face is where it really becomes so critical for us. And making our patient happy in the end is what's most important. And I always say, let the patients tell it themselves.
Everything was fine. In fact, I recommended Dr. Sawa to 2 people. I told them, and you'll have your teeth done by the same man who did the girl on Modern Family. But I don't know if they're going to take me up on it.
Oh, that's nice of you. What do you think now in the end when you get to look at what you see?
Oh, I love it. I love it. In fact, I forget how bad they were. Every once in a while, like my daughter-in-law's shower. So they took a lot of spontaneous pictures, you know, like.
Yeah.
And if you remember, my teeth were so small that when I smiled, I looked like a shopping bag lady. You couldn't see any teeth. And in these pictures, I look good in all of that. Very nice.
Yeah.
And then I'm saying, what happened? I guess the weight helped too. I said, oh, I have teeth. That makes a difference.
Well, if you remember when you came the first time, I said to you, the goal is when you're done for everybody to look at you and say, what have you done? You look great.
Right.
And not to say, who made those teeth, right?
Yes.
And I think that's kind of a standard for me, right? When I meet a lot of the patients that I work with, I'm fortunate, and even some of them I meet on Skype and we get to talk a while or Zoom these days. And I think what's important is that is what we want for our patients, isn't it? We want them to feel better, look better aesthetically, but also functionally. We want them to be solid. And we want people to look at them and say, you look great, what have you done? We don't want them to look at them and say, wow, your teeth are so white, who made those? And I get it. There are a group of people who want that, but there are also a lot of people who don't. And we need to know, and I'll discuss that more in the shade taking and the communication module, which I think is module 5. The other thing that we'll go into in module 5 a little bit is more about the face and understanding the dominant and non-dominant sides. I won't do too much of that today just for time, but I can tell you that every face is different and there's dominant and non-dominant sides to them. And part of our job is understanding, especially as we use either digital technology or even our own hand skills, so the analog version, that we understand how to make the teeth fit into that particular face, not just take a mold or a denture setup and put it into a face without realizing all the other little nuances that we need. So a case like this, the face is really very unsymmetric, and we have to kind of think through all the processes. You can see the lip dynamic is different. It pulls up a lot more on one side, and look at the thinness of the lips as the patient starts to smile. So there's a lot of things happening there that we have to take into account. And in the end, this was going to be a bridge case. So we were going to have, I think, 2 single units and 2 bridges, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason I'm pointing it out is because I had said in module 1 that I don't always use zirconia for bridges because of the connector sizes. Sometimes I want to have metal ceramics. In this case, I had plenty of room for connector sizes. I had no reason not to use a zirconia material. And also you'll notice the preps are kind of minimally invasive preps and not really, really reductive. So we'd have a better option using an aesthetic material underneath. So the provisionals were done, shade taking and communication, which we will go through more in module 5. The design was done, and again, I can never give Jen too much credit for these things because she's become a little computer genius there in the lab amongst all the other things that she does these days that she's so amazing with. I joke and say she's connected to those machines. She has the download on her phone and she's checking them in the middle of the night if everything is running smooth, and it's kind of crazy, but it's kind of cool because I get it. I feel the same way when I'm working on cases, and we're always trying to satisfy the needs. So you'll see the bridge work out of the machine, out of the milling process. And obviously we use a very white zirconia, and I layered that. This was a case from a year or so ago, so I believe it was all VM9. I wasn't using the Lumex completely at that point yet, although I had started testing it. And you'll notice that even though there are bridges, hopefully they all look fairly similar, so we were able to manage that with the connector sizes. And again, I always like the patient's viewpoints of what they see and or what they're thinking.
Okay, so I cannot believe it. I'm finally telling you that today is the last day of my dental journey. I am getting my permanent teeth put in. These are temps. I'm gonna have my permanent teeth going in today. I can't believe it. It's been 6 months, a little bit, no, it's been 8 months since I had 3 of my teeth extracted. I've gone through 2 pairs of temps, and it's just been intense, to say the least.
It comes up there. So what I love, Hannah, look at those triangles. That's the key to your case. The fact that the temperatures are able to hold your triangles of gums is just going to make these teeth look real.
My team works fast, huh?
They're so nice. They look amazing. What? Wow. Can't believe it.
So in the end, the process is the same for us, right? If we want the whiter, straighter, that's fine too. But these are all bridges. I just kind of wanted you to see that even with bridges, if we have the right connectors and we can manage the tissue the right way and create the right embrasure spaces, we can still make things look fairly individual across the board. And that's kind of the process for me over and over again. So I think we're just about on time. I was moving pretty quickly here, so that's good. Module 4 next week, next Tuesday, will be feldspathic ceramic veneers, milled, micro-layered, and refractory. And yes, that key word in there is milled. I'm going to show you some milled feldspathic veneers that I have to be honest and tell you I'm really excited about. I'm doing more and more of them, and I have some interesting cases that I'm popping in there as we speak to get that ready. So that's next Tuesday, 5/5. The other good news is because of all your feedback and your emails, thank you all for them. We've added the other one was module 4. This will be module 5. Module 5 will be the importance of shade communication and photography. And I'm going to break down a lot of photography stuff, but also the importance of understanding tooth form and shade and color and the details of what I look for when I'm trying to match either a single essential or just emulate nature in general. Module 6 was also added, and again, testament to you guys for pushing for these things. Module 6, I'll deal more with implants, some basic parameters of implants, and some pink and white options, and when and where to use pink, and a little bit more focus on how to use the pink. But in general, the rough topic will be just about implants. And then today we finish up with, I threw an in there. Damn, I was doing so well. Today we'll finish up with module 3 again, and I'll open the floor. So I think I'm right about on time. Yes, 1:50, perfection. So I'll open the door for you, Mr. Jim, and hopefully we have a few questions in the mix.
Yes, we do, Peter. We have quite a few questions. I'd like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, use your panel and just go into the question section and email. We will also be posting these videos on our North America VITA Learning channel on our website, along with through Twitter, through Facebook, etc. Those of you who are looking for CE, you will get an email that you will have to fill out, provide a little bit of information for the credits, MBC credit, and we will get you those that CE hour as quick as possible. So the first question, Peter, Dr. Samaras is asking, which is a good one. In your cases, what about any complication, fracturing, chipping between the zirconia and the porcelain junctions on your zirconia cases?
So yes, that's a great question, and I think I'm going to say it's an older school question. And I don't mean that as an insult to you, doctor, for asking it. I think years ago there was a lot more challenges with the zirconia and ceramic. Why? The zirconia is very rigid; it's a much more rigid material. The ceramic has a little bit more flex, so something usually wants to give, and that would tend to be the ceramic over the zirconia. We've addressed that in a lot of ways. Part of it is through firing parameters. We understand the coefficients better today, and that the zirconia takes up a lot more heat and is much slower to cool down. So the difference parameter in how we fire the ceramic onto the zirconia has changed and evolved, and that's just way better today. And I think there's a lot less of the microchipping on that end. The other aspect of that is the substructure, how we design it. Meaning, if you notice my design on the screen, I'm very supportive of the ceramic. And my goal isn't to have this thin coping and then 2 millimeters of ceramic hanging off it. It's really to utilize the zirconia to be more supportive, not only optically, but functionally for my layered material. And then the third part to that question would be, you're talking about bond itself. And although I do agree that the higher firing material tend to bond better, I don't like them because of the fact that I think it's an overfire and it creates a little different matrix for the second layer of ceramic. So I would much rather do a sandblasted surface, which I'm breaking surface tension, putting my either liner material or margin material. And I need to be a little clear. When I build a liner material, I'm building it like a powder. I'm not building it like a wash bake, and then fire that at the higher temperature and then go to my dentins and enamels.
All right, great. So Deborah has a question on dark stumps, preps, or implant abutments. Do you still use a porcelain margin?
So great question, Deborah. Is that Deborah from Maryland? If so, Delaware, I should say. But yes and no. So let's take implant first. If it's an implant, and I'm going to use a metal implant, which I've kind of gone way back to these days, and I tend to use more metal implants, depending on the tissue biotype. So if I have a thin tissue biotype and the implant isn't as deep as I would like it, I'm going to actually do what I did in module 1, where I cut the metal back and create a ceramic margin on the abutment itself and help to get some of the tissue transmission there, and then make a secondary substructure with a ceramic margin. So that would be my ultimate. If it's a natural tooth, and let's say the doctor didn't have the ability to create a shoulder prep, it's a root canal tooth, it's already too subgingival, and we're just dealing with a very dark prep, the best scenario is internal bleaching, but that's not always an option. The second scenario then becomes trying to work with a material that I can do some masking from, and then I'm going to have to work or rely heavier on my fluorescent materials to distract some of the light from getting down into the darkness of the tooth. But let's be clear, if the prep shade is really dark and that darkness travels up the root, which it does, it's going to be very difficult to mask in the end unless you do something either more aggressive with the prep or internally bleach the prep.
All right. So Patricia has a question. Do you press over zirconia? And for the shoulder, and microlayering. So do you press over zirconia to achieve your shoulder, portion of the shoulder?
So
And-
simple answer on that one, Patricia, no, I don't do any press over material. I build all my ceramic margins by hand. I hate to sound cocky with it, but I'm good with ceramic margins. That's the one area I feel cocky with. Everything else I'm pretty insecure on, but margins, I've been doing them for 15 years from the day I started building ceramic. It's the first thing I learned. And I would tell you, I threw two ums in there, and I would tell you that I really believe that I could show you a way to do it very simple, and that if I show you how to do that, at the same time you're kind of doing your wash bake, you will be 2 steps ahead after that one wash bake. So no pressing, all hand built.
All right, and then Kim has a question about wash bake or your initial liner. How much higher in temperature do you use than your basic dentants and powders?
So your liner materials in VM9 are 930 in Fahrenheit, Celsius. So they're about 30 degrees higher. Usually the margin materials are anywhere from 30 to 50 degrees higher. It really depends on what kit you're using or what system you're using. But in the end, most liners and most margin materials are higher in fluorescence and are a higher firing material. They always fire at least 30 to 50 degrees higher than your dentants.
All right. You kind of answered this one, but more specific, in dealing with the gray dark prep shades, would you use a higher opacity zirconia substructure with a margin cutback, or would you use a lower, more translucent substructure?
So I would definitely go with the higher opacity, because I want to remember, higher opacity sounds great, but if it's a substructure, your substructure is usually not more than 0.3, 0.5, 0.6 if you're lucky, depending on how much space you have. So the thinner it gets, even though it was a higher opacity, the more translucent it becomes.
So one of your patients that you showed, the question was, did the doctor do some crown lengthening to increase the VDO? So it must have been the original. They increase the length. Hope you're.
It's easier for me to knock the value down than it is for me to try to raise the value later on.
All right, Peter, can you hear me? You're kind of fading in. Okay, good. All right, so in one of the modules, the fifth week, I think, or maybe it's next week, are you going to go over the facial analyzer a little bit more?
I didn't have that in there, but if something you want, then I'll go through it more. Yes, I'll try to incorporate it either into one of them. I'll try to squeeze it in the way I squeeze in the matrices today. If it's something important to you, and I encourage you all, email me with questions that I didn't answer well or you want to dive into. Look, it's funny. I did a program this morning on about lecturing, and we were talking about what you're supposed to be as a presenter or a lecturer. And the truth of it is besides being a teacher, really our job is to help you, right? So I'm not the person who builds a lecture and sticks to it. I'm actually the complete opposite. I build a rough parameter of a lecture, and then I usually look at the audience and evaluate what they're getting and not getting. So my point is, when you ask a question, I'll shift to that. I don't mind. So if you have things that you'd like me to hit more, just send me another email, and I'll incorporate them into each of the next modules. I'll squeeze them in any way I could.
Question about the digital side. Do you double scan the wax up, or do you just use the software only for frames?
So for a lot of years, we double scanned. And why did we double scan? Well, one, I think it took a little time for me to transition into the digital world. I think Jen would probably say the same. I knew exactly what I wanted, and I didn't want to spend an hour with a mouse trying to manipulate stuff. I think what you already realize is when you're in the digital space, if I shift something a little this way it also shifts something this way. And if I shift it this way, it might shift it a little bit this way. So because you're 3-dimension, you can't just tweak things here and there. And 5 years ago, it was a lot easier for me to grab a spatula and put a dot of wax on it and say, let's just double scan it. Today, no, we don't double scan anymore. Again, Jen is fabulous, amazing. And as she's become more of a ceramist and more of not only our designer, but she understands it better and kind of knows what we're looking for in the end. And I think that's a real important part in the laboratories today, that your designer needs to be a ceramist in essence, or really needs to be one of the most knowledgeable people in the laboratory. And I could tell you, I built my laboratory with that concept that everybody knows everything. So if Helen goes upstairs to design it, or Abe does it, or Keon does it, they're all thinking the same way. We want to absorb, reflect light. And that's the importance of your team. And that's why, like I said, when I teach in laboratories today, I don't want to just teach a ceramic course. I want to teach the laboratory, because it's not enough to just, you know, put more EE9 in the corner. That doesn't fix the problems.
Great. So we understand you use either margin material or a liner at the margin. But Steve has a question about, do you also use these materials on the body of the tooth as well as the incisal?
Yeah, so if you remember that incisal, I'm sorry, I'll go back to it to make it easier for you. So give me 1 second. So if you remember this picture, here, that is all margin material. So it's margin material around the cervical third. It's a margin material in the middle third that I use a very bright white margin material. And then this is a margin material that I mix with a little bit of a blue-gray stain. Do I have to use margin material to do that? No, I could have used liner to do that. The reason I'm doing it all at one time, though, is because the concept of a wash bake to me is different than your average concept of a wash bake. My wash bake should be setting up my canvas for all the things I want it to do. And once that bake is done, I now have a functional canvas to work from that allows me to use less ceramic than you, which, by the way, is why you saw that 4-unit bridge that I showed as the first case, that I was able to do it in one bake. Why? Not because one bake is the only way you should do it. No, because I had control of the framework and I had control of what was going to happen. So my wash bake was my margin material or a liner material, and now my dentin bakes become much more, or my main first bake, I should say, becomes much more user-friendly and time-friendly, that I can get a lot more accomplished in those next bakes.
All right. So in PFMs, you know, we use the oxides as a micro-retentive feature. Ed has a question about, when you alter the zirconia surface, does that also help or enhance the micro-retention of ceramic?
100%. So thank you, Ed. I think I was clear with that in module 2, and maybe I should have added it back in module 3. But in the end, I'm always looking to break surface tension. So do I sandblast my lithium silicates and desilicates? Yes. Do I sandblast my zirconias? 100% yes. Why? Because I must break the surface tension in order to create a better bond between the materials. And of course, with metal ceramics, we have an oxide formulation that we don't get with these other materials. So the better the surface, the rougher the surface, the more grab the surface has, the better bond you'll have to the surface.
So Chris is asking, on the tissue side of the ponics, do you complete the buildup under the ponic, or do you cut back and then add partially?
I'm not sure if I understood the question completely, but I'll answer what I think I understand. So if I'm working a bridge and I have a pontic site, I've obviously, myself and my partner doctor has developed the site, hopefully, or I will develop the site for them, or they will develop the site for me. That's dependent on the different doctors I work with around the world. But in the end, the goal is to have a developed site. Then the second part of that is, I want a very over-fired, softer, smoother material to be touching the tissue. So what I would tend to do with that is, let's say I've done a 3-unit bridge. When I'm glazing the bridge, I'm going to actually add either a little glaze material or a lower fusing material to the underside of my pontic and incorporate that in my glaze cycle. Because I'm trying to create the most smooth, glassy structure so it's easy for the patient to clean and floss in that area.
All right, so the zirconia as it sinters obviously shrinks. So the question is do you have uniform shrinkage of your substructure having those different levels of convexities and concavities?
So I think we need to define that a little bit. So yes, zirconia shrinks, and that's 18 to 21% depending on the brand and the translucency and cubics and knot and so forth. That is a really controlled shrinkage. So if the coping is 1 millimeter thick or it's 2 millimeters thick, you're still getting a very similar bulk of thickness and or shrinkage, I should say. So there's no real effect as far as how much thicker or thinner the material is in the sense of controlling the thickness. Where it is more pertinent is when I layer the ceramic on it, because the ceramic has a much higher rate of shrinkage to it and keeps shrinking from multiple firing. So if I'm using less ceramic, which I am today because I'm using more of the substructure as my canvas, then I have the ability to control that in my bakes more than the actual subframe. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so when you're doing a full coverage crown, what's the minimum thickness, ceramic layering thickness that you like?
So in a full coverage crown, ceramics are made to work in 1.2 to 1.5 millimeters. It's where they work best. So if I'm doing full coverage, like in the Ella case, the full mouth zirconia case I showed you, we had full coverage preps. I had a good 1.5 millimeters to work with. My substructures were basically 0.3 to 0.5, depending on where it was, and that left me 1.2 to 1 millimeter of materials to work with. Can I work in less today? Yes, I can, but I have to think differently of my materials. In other words, if I'm using dentin at 1 millimeter thick and enamel at 0.5 millimeter thick, well, that combination gives me a basic range of a shade, A1, A2, 1M1, 1M2. If I change the formula and I use more dentin, it doesn't give me a better restoration. It just gives me more light penetration, which means it could lower my value rather than raise the value. If I use less dentin, the same thing can happen. Because I have less material to be penetrated by light, the easier it could lower the value, or I could have the substructure be more present in the value intake. So the point, I think, the longer answer to your question is, my job and your job is to manage space and understand what materials really work in that space. I'll try to address that a lot more in the veneer module, because I'll talk a lot more about layering in that.
So if you've completed your restoration, your crown, and there's a need for a margin repair, is there a material you use?
Yeah, so at that point, there always usually is a little kind of margin you want to finalize at the end. I'll always do that in the glaze, and I basically just use either a translucent dentin, like a TD dentin if I'm in EM9, or I might use a dentin with a little bit of a translucent material, or I might just use a pure translucent, and that depends on like an enamel, and that really depends on the prep shade underneath it. If it's a lighter natural prep, then I want the translucency. If it's a darker prep and I'm trying to mask, I might use a little bit more opacity mixed in with the translucency to get a better balance out of it. But I'm always doing that in the glaze.
Right. So after your initial sintering, do you ever run it through a secondary crystallization or firing cycle to try to achieve more translucency?
So yes and no, and let me clarify those two, because I don't want people to get confused. When you sinter zirconia, it is sintered. It's done. You can't resinter it. I mean, you can. I'm not sure what the effects are, but zirconia is very color stable and very stable because of the high firing sintering temperature that you're putting onto it. So there's the crystallization work doesn't go into that zirconia world. So get that out of there. But what I do after I grind on my zirconia and adjust it and kind of do different things to get my mamelon structures where I want them, I do sandblast them aggressively, and then I run them in a conditioning program. If you don't have that program, I will gladly send it to you. Just send me an email. It's basically bringing it up to about 1,050 degrees C and holding it for 10 or 15 minutes. And it was a program that McLaren and Giordano did years ago that I think is still viable. But I also want to be clear, and I'm sorry for my longer answers. I'm going to tell you that I still use that program from 10 years ago. I'm also going to tell you that there are scientific studies on that program that say it does 0. So realistically, I'm not sure if that program truly stops crack propagation or if it does nothing. But because I'm Italian and superstitious, I've been doing it for 10 years and I just keep doing that program. But I can honestly argue that there are two sides to that argument, and there are research on both sides that say it's useful and some say it's not useful.
So on your lithium silicate, disilicate restorations, do you do a wash bake similar to the your zirconia frameworks?
No, so on lithium silicates or D-silicates, I'm not. And the reason for that is the optics of the lithium silicate are a little bit better, or silicates are a little bit better than the zirconia optics. And I don't really need to create as much. Although in my buildup, I will incorporate some fluorescent materials. So like there's some newer fluorescent materials in the new Lumex AC material, or I might use another material if I was using a different system that had a little bit more of a fluorescence to it, because I do want to create fluorescence. But the challenge with that is usually when I'm doing silicates or D-silicates, I only have very little layering. It's very rare that I'm doing a D-silicate or silicate and I'm still layering 1.5 millimeters of ceramic. Most of the time those are micro layered and you just don't have the space in there to kind of really work through with a lot of different materials.
So when you aerabrate or sandblast, do you have any special grit size of your particles or the?
Yeah, exactly. We do actually. We use a very specific one. It's we jog my memory. It's a Brazilian oxide, and it comes in. It's 100 micron, and I get it from a friend of mine's company. It's a very pure. It's kind of a more expensive sandblasting material. It's from a company called American Recovery, and the reason behind it is just so you know, when you buy a sandblasting material and they tell you it's 50 micron or 100 micron or 150, what that really means is the smallest particle is that size, but there's a lot of other different sizes in it. And that's a little deceiving, kind of like stone companies do that to you too, right? They tell you, well, they expand 0.09, baloney, none of them really do. So with the oxides, you want to be careful and try to have as pure and clean of a material as you can. And the one we use for that is an American Recovery 100 micron.
All right, so it's a follow-up. Kirsten has a follow-up on your pontics. He's asking whether it would be better to leave the tissue contact of your pontics polished as opposed to ceramic.
Yeah, so yes and no. So I don't care if you leave it in zirconia, because by the way, the studies are showing that if the zirconia is polished well, that it has a really nice interaction with tissue, or if the ceramic is polished well, that it has a really nice interaction with tissue. Either one of them is fine. It's really about surface, and let me explain what I mean by that. You know, understand a lot of the older studies gave us some misleading information. What do I mean by that? So we were taught years ago that the reason you wanted gold collars on your crowns was because the metal was better than ceramic there. Well, that's not really true, because metal oxidizes, and we didn't really understand that. The real reason ceramic didn't look good years ago is because you didn't understand how to manage the color. We didn't have all the materials that we had. So you would put ceramic down by, picture a coping of a margin, zirconia, metal, it doesn't matter, and it's a feather edge prep. And now you have to put ceramic there. And in the end, how do you get that very thin area of ceramic to look warm and colorful? Well, the way you did that was by painting stains on the outside. Those stains are metallic oxides. They basically look like sandpaper under a microscope. And that's what we were kind of testing it to. So it wasn't a really fair judgment. Today, if you're building more to my buildup, where I don't put stains on the outsides of crowns pretty much ever, you'll have a different situation. And you have a situation where I can now polish that material, or I can overfire that material and create a glass-like matrix, which is much better for the tissue to heal around and much easier to clean around.
All right, so when you do sandblast the zirconia, do you recall what the PSI is, what pressure?
It's 2 bars, 2 to 3 bars. It really depends on every sandblast is a little bit different, but it's basically 2 to 3 bars.
And then Chris has a question about, are you using pre-shaded zirconia, or are you using a white zirconia that you color?
Yeah, so great question, Chris. I'm going to be honest and tell you I'm 90% white. I'm also not a huge fan of the multi-layers, and I'll go through that a little bit more next week. It doesn't mean they're bad. For a layering concept, I'll show you why I kind of don't go that way. If you're going monolithic, it makes a little more sense. But we're about 90% white, and then we'll switch. We're kind of basic in the lab. What do I mean by that? We pretty much use 4 opaques, 4 zirconias, 4 of this. We kind of follow the old seasonal things that were taught years ago, meaning that I don't need 9,000 opaques. I just need 4 or 5 to give me everything I need. I don't need 9,000 dentins for that matter. I need 4 or 5 to give me what I need. And I think that's years ago, I put together a signature kit with VITA, and I did it for a reason. But I really believe that that's what we need is our basics. I think I could do almost everything with 5 dentins. I could do almost everything with 5 enamels. So it's similar to me with all the processes. I think we overkill it sometimes and overthink it. I'd always rather start with either higher value inside and break it down, or more warmth inside and try to add it up depending on what my prep shade is.
All right, so Peter, that ends the questions. I'd like to thank you very much for participating and helping us walk through a lot of these controversies, questions that many of us have as technicians as we do our day-to-day work. I would like to remind everyone that for the next 3 more weeks, on Tuesday, 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time and 10 o'clock Pacific Time, Peter will continue this series, and all of the recordings will be posted on our website, on the VITA Learning websites, as well as Facebook and so forth. We also will provide CE, so you should be seeing a email that tells you kind of how it guides you through on how to get those CE hours. So Peter, any last thoughts?
No, thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to the whole VITA company for organizing this. It wasn't easy, especially in these crazy times, and thank you for it. I'm excited about next week. Actually, I've been kind of putting that one together for the last few days and bringing cases in and out. So next week's going to be great for feldspathic. And then I'm actually really excited that we added 5 and 6. I think I could break things down backwards a little bit more. So I really appreciate, more than you guys know, all the nice emails and texts and comments. And thank you so much for that. And it's an honor that you spend time with me each week. And I look forward to the next few weeks. And I look more forward to hopefully seeing everybody face to face soon. So thank you all for being here.
And thank you, Peter. For everyone that's registered, this will conclude the webinar. We hope to see you again next Tuesday, so please join us. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody. Same bad time, same bad channel.